April 15, 1912. Washington, D.C. The cherry blossoms had just passed their peak, their delicate petals now a soft carpet on the manicured lawns of the Capitol. Spring had arrived, bringing with it a sense of renewal, a forward momentum, a feeling that so defined the restless energy of the American Republic in the new century. But inside the corridors of the United States Senate, the air was not filled with the scent of spring. It was thick with the electric hum of telegraph wires and the suffocating weight of uncertainty. The day was overcast, a blanket of gray cloud pressing down on the city, mirroring the confusion that was beginning to spread like a fever among the most powerful men in the nation. In his office, a space of dark wood, leather-bound books, and the quiet dignity of federal power, Senator William Alden Smith of Michigan sat behind his imposing desk. He was not a man given to flights of fancy. A former railroad lawyer, a Republican of the old school, he was pragmatic, tenacious, and possessed a populist streak that made him a formidable interrogator. He believed in facts, in accountability, in the simple bedrock principle that power, especially corporate power, must answer to the people. And on this Monday morning, the facts were maddeningly, terrifyingly elusive. The news had begun to trickle in late the night before, fragmented and contradictory. A whisper from a wireless station in Newfoundland, a garbled message relayed through a dozen operators across 1,000 miles of wire. The words themselves seemed impossible, a violation of the natural order, as men of his era understood it. Titanic. The name alone was a declaration of dominance, a monument to the Gilded Age's unshakable faith in technology and capital. It was the largest moving object ever created by man, a floating palace of steel and luxury, and it was, by all accounts, unsinkable. The word was a mantra, repeated in newspapers, in advertisements, in the confident pronouncements of its builders and its owners. Yet the whispers from the ether spoke of a collision, an iceberg, distress signals, silence. Throughout the morning, Senator Smith, like millions of others, was caught in a storm of information and misinformation. The first reports reaching the American press were strangely optimistic, born of denial and the sheer inconceivability of the alternative. The New York offices of the White Star Line, the ship's operator, initially insisted the great liner was fine. They issued a statement, clinical and reassuring, that while the Titanic had struck ice, she was unsinkable and was proceeding under her own power, or at worst, being taken in tow. Some papers even ran headlines, declaring all passengers safe. It was a comforting lie, a desperate attempt to hold back a truth too monstrous to contemplate. But Senator Smith was a man who understood the machinery of power and the language of silence. The Titanic was not just a British ship, it was the crown jewel of the International Mercantile Marine Company, a colossal shipping trust, conceived and controlled by the most powerful American of them all, John Pierpont Morgan. It was an American-owned vessel, steaming towards an American port, carrying some of the wealthiest and most influential citizens of the United States. John Jacob Astor IV, his fortune a pillar of New York society, Benjamin Guggenheim, a titan of industry, Isidor Straus, co-owner of Macy's department store. These were not just names on a passenger list. They were symbols of American might, men whose actions shaped the national economy. Their silence, the ship's silence, was a void that grew more ominous with every passing hour. As the morning wore on, the static of confusion began to resolve into a terrifying signal. A new message, this one originating from the liner Olympic, the Titanic's sister ship, was relayed to the White Star offices. It contained a chillingly concise report from the rescue vessel Carpathia. The message stated that the Carpathia had arrived at the disaster site to find only lifeboats and wreckage. The Titanic, it confirmed, had gone down at 2:20 in the morning. And then the devastating calculus. The message reported only 675 souls saved, most of them women and children. 675. Smith did the math in his head. The ship had been carrying over 2,200 people. The number hung in the air of his quiet office, an obscene monument to failure. The gap between those two figures was a chasm of unimaginable horror, a silent scream from the depths of the icy Atlantic. In that moment, the tragedy ceased to be a distant maritime incident. It became an American crisis, an American catastrophe. The ship was owned by an American trust. Its destination was an American city. Its most famous victims were American icons, and the survivors were now steaming towards American shores. The responsibility, Smith felt with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, lay here, in Washington. He saw the narrative already beginning to form. It would be a story of a tragic accident, an act of God, a tale of British heroism, and stiff upper-lip courage in the face of death. The British Board of Trade would conduct an inquiry, of course. It would be a polite, dignified affair, run by men of the same class and background as the ship's owners and officers. It would be designed to reassure, to restore confidence, to protect the interests of the British maritime establishment. Smith knew this script. He had seen it play out 100 times in the world of railroad trusts and industrial monopolies. It was a script of quiet accommodation and managed accountability, and he would not allow it to be read. As the full, staggering scale of the loss became undeniable, a cold fury began to build within him. This was not merely an accident. It was a failure. A failure of technology, of procedure, of judgment, and perhaps of morality. Why were there so few lifeboats? Why had the ship been traveling so fast through a known ice field? Why had the wireless warnings from other ships apparently been ignored? These were not questions to be politely asked in a London boardroom weeks from now. They were questions that demanded immediate, aggressive, and public answers. And the witnesses, the surviving officers, the crew, the chairman of the White Star Line, J. Bruce Ismay, who had incomprehensibly survived while so many others perished, were all on a ship, the Carpathia, heading for New York Harbor. They were heading for American jurisdiction. The thought solidified into a plan, audacious and unprecedented. Before the British could bring their people home, before the story could be shaped and polished by corporate interests, America would act. He would use the full, untempered power of the United States Senate to seize the narrative, to subpoena the witnesses the moment they touched American soil, and to conduct an investigation so swift and so piercing it would stun the world. He envisioned it clearly, a full-scale Senate inquiry, not in a stuffy committee room but in the grand ballroom of the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York, under the full glare of the press. He would put J. Bruce Ismay himself on the stand. He would force the surviving officers to recount under oath every decision, every ignored warning, every moment of the sinking. He would give a voice to the stokers from the boiler rooms and the stewards from the first-class suites. He would uncover not just what happened, but why. It was a declaration of war against a century of maritime tradition and British naval supremacy. It was a direct challenge to the powerful interests of J.P. Morgan himself. Many of his colleagues would call it an overreach, an intrusion into the affairs of a foreign nation. But William Alden Smith saw it differently. He saw over 1,500 souls, many of them poor immigrants seeking a new life in his country, lost in the freezing dark. He saw the hubris of an age that had come to worship its own creations, an age that had mistaken luxury for safety and speed for progress. And he saw a duty, a solemn American duty, to demand an accounting. As the telegraph machines in the next room chattered on, their frantic clicks sounding like the frantic heartbeats of a nation in shock, Senator Smith began to draft the resolution. It would grant his subcommittee the power to compel testimony, to subpoena witnesses, to uncover the truth. The story of the Titanic had begun in a Belfast shipyard and departed from an English port, but its final, definitive chapter, he vowed, would be written here, in America. The hidden American story of the Titanic was about to begin, not on the waves of the Atlantic, but in the silent, wood-paneled office of a stubborn senator from Michigan, who refused to let the silence win. To understand the forces that propelled the Titanic towards its icy fate, one must look not to the shipyards of Belfast, but to the financial heart of the Gilded Age, a granite fortress on the corner of Wall and Broad Street in New York City. This was the headquarters of J.P. Morgan and Company, a private bank that functioned as a de facto central bank for the United States, and its master, John Pierpont Morgan, was more than a financier. He was an emperor of capital, a man whose sheer force of will could bend industries, governments, and even the global economy to his design. Morgan was a collector of magnificent things, rare manuscripts, Renaissance art, entire companies, and by the turn of the 20th century, he had set his sights on his grandest acquisition yet, the Atlantic Ocean. The North Atlantic shipping lanes were the lifeblood of the modern world, the great commercial artery connecting the industrial might of America with the empires of Europe. But it was a chaotic and fiercely competitive business, dominated by British and German lines. Cunard, White Star, Hamburg America, North German Lloyd. They battled for supremacy in a costly arms race, building ever larger, faster, and more luxurious ships. To a man like Morgan, who abhorred competition and saw order and efficiency in consolidation, this was an intolerable state of affairs. His solution, as it had been with steel, railroads, and electricity, was the trust. He would create a single colossal entity that would swallow its competitors, control the market, and impose order on the waves. In 1902, this vision became a reality. Morgan orchestrated the creation of the International Mercantile Marine Company, or IMM. It was a leviathan, a holding company, that acquired a stunning portfolio of shipping lines, including the prestigious British-flagged White Star Line. The deal was a thunderclap in the world of international finance and politics. For the first time, a huge swath of the British merchant marine, the pride of the empire, was now effectively under the control of an American financier. The British government was so alarmed that it responded by providing a massive subsidy to the rival Cunard Line to build two superliners, the Lusitania and the Mauretania, on the condition that they remain purely British-owned and available to the Royal Navy in wartime. This government-backed challenge only spurred Morgan's ambition. The IMM, and by extension its flagship company, the White Star Line, needed to respond. They needed to build ships that would not just compete with Cunard's, but utterly eclipse them. The goal, however, was subtly different. While Cunard pursued speed, chasing the coveted blue riband for the fastest Atlantic crossing, J. Bruce Ismay, the chairman of the White Star Line, who now answered to Morgan's board, proposed a new strategy. They would concede speed to Cunard. Instead, they would build ships of unprecedented size, and above all, unprecedented luxury. They would be the largest moving objects on the planet, floating palaces so grand and so stable that passengers would forget they were at sea. This was a vision perfectly attuned to the sensibilities of the Gilded Age, an era that measured success in scale and opulence. The result of this vision was the Olympic-class three sister ships that would dominate the Atlantic: the Olympic, the Titanic, and the yet-to-be-completed Gigantic, later renamed the Britannic. The Titanic was the apotheosis of this philosophy. It was a physical manifestation of the era's boundless confidence. Its first-class accommodations were not mere cabins. They were opulent suites modeled on the grand houses of London and New York. The grand staircase, the veranda cafe, the Turkish baths, the squash court, every detail was designed to cater to a new class of international plutocrats who moved between continents as easily as they moved between their city homes and country estates. And it was this very class of American industrial royalty that would populate its maiden voyage. On board for that fateful journey was a roll call of American power and wealth, each a story in themselves. Colonel John Jacob Astor IV was for all intents and purposes American royalty. He was the inheritor of a vast real estate and fur-trading fortune, the richest man on the ship, and one of the richest in the world. At 47, he was a figure of immense privilege but also of some scandal. He had recently divorced his first wife and married Madeline Force, an 18-year-old, a union that scandalized the staid society of New York. They were returning from an extended honeymoon in Europe and Egypt, allowing time for the gossip to die down, with Madeline now pregnant with their child. Astor was more than just an idle rich man. He was an inventor, a science fiction novelist, and a real estate developer who had built the St. Regis and helped build the Waldorf Astoria hotels, monuments to the very luxury the Titanic embodied. He boarded the ship at Cherbourg, a king returning to his kingdom. Also on board was Benjamin Guggenheim, heir to a colossal mining fortune. He was a man caught between the strictures of his class and his own more bohemian desires. Traveling with his French mistress, the singer Leontine Hobart, he was registered under a pseudonym, a common practice for men of his station seeking discretion. His wife and family were at home in New York, awaiting his return. Guggenheim represented the industrial engine of America, the raw power of metals and minerals that fueled the nation's growth. His presence on the ship was a testament to the global nature of American business. And then there was Isidor Straus, a man who represented a different kind of American dream, a German Jewish immigrant who had arrived in America as a boy. He and his brother Nathan had built a small crockery business into a retail empire, becoming the co-owners of R.H. Macy Company, the world's largest department store. He was a respected philanthropist, a former congressman, and a man deeply devoted to his wife of 40 years, Ida. They were returning from a winter holiday in the south of France. Unlike the inherited wealth of Astor or the industrial might of Guggenheim, Strauss embodied the story of mercantile success, of building a commercial dynasty through shrewdness and hard work. His journey was a return home to the city his store helped define. These men, Astor, Guggenheim, Strauss, were not merely passengers. They were avatars of the American Gilded Age. Their wealth was the bedrock upon which Morgan's EMM was built. Their demand for luxury was the reason for the Titanic's existence. The ship was a gilded cage, a floating extension of their world on Fifth Avenue in Newport, Rhode Island. It was a microcosm of the rigid class structure of the time, the opulence of their suites, the deference of the crew, the sheer space dedicated to their comfort, stood in stark, brutal contrast to the conditions in steerage. Down in the lower decks, hundreds of immigrants were crammed into simple, crowded dormitories. They were Swedes, Irish, Finns, Lebanese, and Armenians, people from every corner of a struggling Europe, drawn by the promise of America. For them, the Titanic was not a luxury hotel. It was a ferry to a new life. They had sold everything they owned for a one-way ticket to New York, the gateway to a land where they believed the rigid class barriers of the old world did not exist. Their destination was the same as Astor's, but their America was a world away. The ship, therefore, was a vessel of profound contradictions. It was British-built and crewed, flying a British flag. Yet it was American-owned, and its soul was purely American in its ambition, its scale, and its celebration of wealth. It was at once a monument to the established power of the industrial elite, and a vessel of hope for the powerless. It was a machine of immense technological sophistication, yet it carried a number of lifeboats that was tragically, almost medievally, inadequate, a number that met but did not exceed the outdated regulations of the British Board of Trade. This was the world that J.P. Morgan had built, a world of immense power and breathtaking blind spots, a world where the appearance of safety, the sheer heft and scale of a thing, was mistaken for the reality of it. Morgan himself was supposed to be on the maiden voyage. His personal suite was booked, but at the last minute, he cancelled his trip, choosing to extend his vacation in France. The decision saved his life. But his spirit, his philosophy, his relentless drive for consolidation and scale, was everywhere on that ship. The Titanic was his creation, the ultimate expression of his belief that men of his caliber could, through sheer force of will and capital, tame any force, be it a market, a rival, or even the North Atlantic itself. As the great ship steamed out of Southampton, and later from Cherbourg and Queenstown, it was more than just a vessel beginning a journey. It was a statement, a declaration of an age's confidence in itself, an age that believed it had conquered nature, perfected society, and built a world that was, for the right people, unsinkable. The cage was gilded, the passengers were aboard, and the destination was New York. The ocean, ancient and indifferent, was waiting. April 10th, 1912. The port of Southampton, England. A cold, grey morning could not dampen the palpable sense of occasion. A vast crowd had gathered at the docks. A sea of faces turned up towards the black-hulled behemoth that towered over the pier buildings. The RMS Titanic was more than a ship. It was a temporary city, a statement of national and corporate pride. 4 colossal funnels, the 4th, a dummy for aesthetic balance and ventilation, rose against the sky. The name, painted in proud gold letters on her bow and stern, seemed not a descriptor, but a fact. As the first passengers began to arrive, the ship's rigid social hierarchy became immediately visible. The first-class passengers, arriving in special trains from London, were whisked through a private entrance, their mountains of luggage handled by an army of porters. They were the Astors, the Guggenheims, the Strausses, but also the Wideners of Philadelphia, the Thayers of Pennsylvania, a constellation of American industrial families. For them, the next 6 days were to be an extension of their terrestrial lives, a seamless transition from one mansion to another, this one merely afloat. The ship was their playground. John Jacob Astor and his young pregnant wife, Madeline, settled into their parlor suite on C deck, one of the most lavish on the ship, complete with a private promenade deck. They were the center of quiet attention, their recent scandalous marriage, a topic of whispered conversation over afternoon tea. For them, the journey was the final leg of a long escape, a return to the heart of a society they both dominated and defied. The promise of New York was the promise of home, of facing the gossip, and of the birth of a new heir to the Astor dynasty. In another part of the ship, Isidore and Ida Strauss, accompanied by their maid and valet, settled into their own comfortable suite. Their journey was one of routine, the familiar passage of wealthy Americans who wintered in Europe. Their letters home would have spoken of pleasantries, of the calm seas, of the remarkable size and stability of the new liner. For them, New York was not just home but the center of their life's work, the location of their great store, the city where their children and grandchildren awaited them. Their promise was one of reunion and the quiet comforts of a life well lived. The ship hummed with the energy of this elite world. Men gathered in the leather-chaired smoking room to discuss business deals and stock prices over brandy and cigars, the wireless telegraph allowing them to remain connected to their empires even in the middle of the ocean. Women promenaded on the enclosed decks, showcasing the latest Paris fashions, or gathered in the opulent lounges for gossip and bridge. The ship's orchestra played in the reception room, a constant, gentle soundtrack to their gilded lives. The American novelist Helen Churchill Candy, a 52-year-old journalist and early feminist, was traveling alone in first class, rushing back to the United States to be with her son who had been injured in an accident. She observed this world with a writer's eye, noting in her later accounts the general atmosphere of relaxation, of pleasure, of luxury. She described the ship as a place where care was banished, and duty was forgotten. This was the promise of the Titanic to its first-class passengers, a perfect, hermetically sealed world of comfort and privilege, a brief, blissful pause in the relentless pursuit of wealth and power. But just a few decks below, separated by watertight doors and a vast social chasm, a different set of promises was unfolding. In the third class, or steerage, compartments, The atmosphere was not one of relaxation, but of fervent, anxious hope. Here, hundreds of men, women, and children were packed into modest, clean but crowded cabins. They were the lifeblood of American immigration, the human fuel for the factories, farms, and construction sites of a booming nation. An Irish contingent from County Mayo, young men and women leaving behind poverty for the promise of jobs in Chicago or Boston. A large group of Swedes, families who had sold their small farms to start anew in the vast agricultural lands of Minnesota and the Dakotas. A family of Lebanese Maronites fleeing the crumbling Ottoman Empire for a chance at religious freedom and economic opportunity in Pennsylvania. For them, the $600 price of a first-class suite was an unimaginable fortune. Their own tickets, costing around $40, often represented their entire life savings. They did not have private promenade decks. They had the open well decks at the bow and stern, where they would gather in the chilly Atlantic air to talk, to play music on fiddles and pipes, and to dream of the future. Their conversations were not of stock prices, but of job prospects, not of Paris fashions, but of the relatives waiting for them in America, who would give them a place to stay and help them find their first job. Their promise was not of a luxurious vacation, but of a complete transformation of their existence. A young Swedish woman, Alma Paulsson, was traveling with her 4 small children to join her husband, Niels, who had already established himself in Chicago. Her journey was one of family reunification, the culmination of years of saving and planning. Her promise was the simple, powerful dream of having her family whole again under one roof in a new land. The ship itself was a source of wonder to them. The electric lights, the running water, the sheer amount of food served in their simple dining saloon, it was a level of modernity and abundance many had never experienced. To them, the Titanic was not just a ship, it was America itself in miniature. It was vast, powerful, and clean, a symbol of the better world they were sailing towards. The first few days of the voyage passed in a serene, almost dreamlike state. The weather was unusually calm and clear. The sea was a flat, glassy expanse, allowing the great liner to push ahead at a steady, powerful clip of over 21 knots. The powerful engines, deep in the ship's belly, were a constant, reassuring thrum. The daily routine settled in. First-class passengers enjoyed lavish, multi-course meals in the grand dining saloon. In second class, a comfortable world of professionals, clergy, and middle-class families. Life was a slightly less ornate version of first class. And in third class, the initial anxieties of the journey gave way to a sense of community and shared anticipation. Sunday, April 14th, was the 5th day at sea. The ship was more than halfway to its destination, due to arrive in New York on Tuesday evening or Wednesday morning. A church service was held in the first-class dining saloon, with Captain Edward Smith, a venerable veteran of the White Star Line on his final voyage before retirement, presiding. The hymns echoed in the grand room, a chorus of confident voices giving thanks for their safe passage. The sermon, one can imagine, would have touched on themes of providence and the marvels of God's creation, as exemplified by the magnificent vessel they were on. That afternoon, the temperature began to drop. The crisp spring air turned bitingly cold. This was the first sign that they were entering the vicinity of the great ice fields off the coast of Newfoundland. But on the enclosed, steam-heated decks of first class, the change was barely noticed. The orchestra played, tea was served, and plans were made for arrival in New York. Down in steerage, the cold was more keenly felt on the open decks, but the mood was celebratory. Sunday night was a time for music and dancing, a final party before the new life began. They were so close now. The promise of America was just over the horizon. The Statue of Liberty, the skyline of Manhattan, the chaotic, hopeful crush of Ellis Island. It was all becoming real. Throughout that Sunday, a series of invisible messages crackling through the cold night air began to arrive in the Titanic's wireless room. They were warnings from other ships in the area. The SS Caronia reported icebergs, growlers, and field ice. The SS Nordam reported much ice. The SS America sent a message about passing 2 large icebergs. Later, the SS Mesaba sent a direct warning to the Titanic, detailing a large belt of heavy pack ice and large icebergs directly in her path. These messages were received by the 2 wireless operators, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, but they were employees of the Marconi Company, not the White Star Line. Their primary duty was to send and receive the personal messages of the wealthy first-class passengers, stock updates, business instructions, personal greetings, a service that generated significant revenue. The ice warnings were a secondary concern. The crucial Mesaba message, a direct and urgent warning about the specific danger ahead, was never delivered to the bridge. The final, most critical warning came from a small steamer, the SS Californian, which had stopped for the night, completely surrounded by ice, not 20 miles away. Its wireless operator, Cyril Evans, tried to warn the Titanic's operator, Jack Phillips. "I say, old man," Evans tapped out. "We are stopped and surrounded by ice." Phillips, overwhelmed with a backlog of passenger messages for the powerful relay station at Cape Race, Newfoundland, was annoyed by the interruption. He replied with a brusque, now infamous message. Shut up, I am busy, I am working Cape Race." Evans, dejected, listened for a few more minutes, and then as his shift was over, he turned off his wireless set and went to bed. The Titanic, the ship that was a universe unto itself, had just cut itself off from the one voice that could have saved it. Aboard the great ship, the passengers were oblivious. The last of the dinner plates were being cleared. The orchestra was playing in the lounge. John Jacob Astor might have been enjoying a cigar in the smoking room. Isidore and Ida Strauss were likely preparing for bed. In steerage, the last of the dancers were finishing their reels. The ship sailed on, a blaze of light and music, plunging deeper into the darkness. The ocean of promises was about to deliver on a threat that no one on board could have ever imagined. 11:39 p.m. Sunday, April 14th, 1912. The North Atlantic. The sea was preternaturally calm, a vast dark mirror reflecting a sky brilliant with stars but absent a moon. The air was razor-sharp, the temperature hovering just below freezing. On the bridge of the RMS Titanic, the officers on watch peered into the blackness. The ship was slicing through the water at a speed of approximately 22 knots, nearly her maximum. This was a point of pride, a demonstration of the power and reliability of her massive reciprocating engines and single steam turbine. The pressure to maintain speed was immense. It was an unspoken rule of the competitive North Atlantic run. A swift passage meant a punctual arrival in New York, which pleased passengers, enhanced the company's reputation, and ensured a quick turnaround for the next profitable voyage. Despite the multiple ice warnings received throughout the day, there was no order to reduce speed. Captain Smith himself had retired to his cabin for the night, leaving First Officer William Murdoch in command on the bridge. The captain had attended a dinner party held in his honor by the Wideners, a wealthy Philadelphia family, and had reportedly remarked on the unusual calm of the sea. This very calmness was a hidden danger. Without wind there would be no telltale white water breaking at the base of an iceberg, making it far more difficult to spot in the dark. The lookouts, Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee, were stationed high above in the crow's nest. Their eyes, accustomed to the darkness, scanned the horizon, but they were working under a significant handicap. The binoculars for the crow's nest were missing. They were locked in a cabinet, and a key was held by an officer who had been transferred off the ship in Southampton and had forgotten to hand it over. The lookouts had to rely on the naked eye alone to pierce the deceptive moonless dark. Inside, the ship was settling down for the night. The last of the social gatherings were winding down. In the first-class smoking room, a few men lingered over a final card game. In their C-deck suite, John Jacob and Madeline Astor had likely retired. Colonel Astor, an early riser, would have been looking forward to another day at sea, perhaps a vigorous game of squash followed by a stroll on the promenade deck. For him and his wife, the ship was a sanctuary, and the steady vibration of the engines was a lullaby, carrying them closer to home and the next chapter of their lives. In another suite, Isidore and Ida Strauss were also likely asleep. Their lives were governed by routine and a deep, abiding affection for one another. After 40 years of marriage, they were rarely apart. The journey was unremarkable, a comfortable means to an end, returning to their family in New York. The thought of danger would have been utterly alien. The ship was the epitome of modern engineering, a fortress of steel. Danger was something that happened in a different, less ordered world. Down in steerage, the last of the music had faded. Families were crammed into their small cabins, the children finally asleep, dreaming of a new world. For them, the ship's powerful, unceasing momentum was the very engine of their hopes. Every turn of the propellers brought them closer to escaping the past and embracing the future. They had placed their absolute faith in this vessel, in its captain, in the unseen men who guided it through the night. It was a faith born of necessity. They had no other choice. At 11:40 p.m., high in the crow's nest, Frederick Fleet saw it. A shape, darker than the dark sea, directly in their path. It was small at first, then grew with terrifying speed, an iceberg. He immediately struck the lookout bell 3 times, the signal for an object dead ahead, and seized the telephone connecting him to the bridge. "What did you see?" a calm voice asked from the other end. "Iceberg. Right ahead," Fleet yelled, his voice tight with adrenaline. On the bridge, First Officer Murdoch reacted instantly. He barked out a series of rapid-fire commands. Hard a starboard. This was an order to the quartermaster at the wheel, to turn the ship as far to the left as possible. Simultaneously, he telegraphed the engine room, full astern. a desperate attempt to slow the ship's massive forward momentum. These were the textbook reactions, the trained instincts of an experienced officer. But the Titanic was not a textbook ship. Her sheer size and speed gave her colossal inertia. Turning the vessel was like trying to steer a skyscraper. It responded slowly, ponderously. For what felt like an eternity, but was in reality only about 37 seconds, the ship continued its forward plunge. From the bridge, they watched in agonizing slow motion as the great bow began to swing to port. It seemed for a heart-stopping moment that they might just clear the ice. The berg, a mountain of ancient compressed freshwater ice, loomed over the starboard bow. But it wasn't the visible mountain that was the greatest threat. It was the submerged spur, the underwater ram of solid ice that was waiting for them. The ship didn't collide head-on. Instead, it sideswiped the iceberg. Those on deck and on the bridge heard a grinding, rumbling sound. A slight shudder, a jarring vibration, ran through the length of the hull. For many passengers, it was barely noticeable. In the first-class dining saloon, where staff were cleaning up, some heard what sounded like a tearing of calico. Others described it as the sound of 1,000 marbles being rolled across a floor. American survivor Archibald Gracie IV, a military historian and amateur writer, was asleep in his cabin. He was awakened by what he called a sudden grinding, jarring shock. He noted the time on his watch, 11:45 p.m. He was not alarmed, assuming a propeller blade had been dropped, or some other minor mechanical issue had occurred. He, like many others, simply lay back down, confident in the ship's resilience. But deep below the waterline, on the starboard side, a catastrophic injury had been inflicted. The iceberg's spur had buckled the ship's steel plates, popping rivets, and opening a series of gashes along a span of nearly 300 feet. It was not one continuous hole, as was long believed, but a series of punctures and breaches that fatally compromised the first 5, and possibly 6, of the ship's 16 watertight compartments. The ship was designed to stay afloat with its first 4 compartments breached, but not 5. Never 5, the math was relentless and unforgiving. As the icy Atlantic water began to pour into the bow, the fate of the RMS Titanic was sealed. The ship's designer, Thomas Andrews, was on board for the maiden voyage, a common practice to observe a new ship's performance. He was summoned to the bridge by Captain Smith. After a quick tour of the damaged forward sections and a rapid calculation based on the ship's blueprints, he delivered the verdict. His voice, witnesses later recalled, was calm, almost clinical, but his words were a death sentence. The ship was mortally wounded. The water flooding the first 5 compartments would weigh the bow down, causing it to sink deeper. As the bow sank, the water would spill over the top of the watertight bulkheads, which did not extend all the way to the upper decks, and flood the next compartment, and then the next, in a slow, inexorable cascade. Andrews gave the ship a maximum of 2 hours before she would founder. 2 hours, to evacuate over 2,200 people into the freezing night, with lifeboats for only half that number. Captain Smith, a man with a flawless 40-year career at sea, was faced with an impossible reality. The unsinkable ship was sinking beneath his feet. The calm, professional demeanor of the bridge crew began to crack. The order was given to uncover the lifeboats and to muster the passengers and crew. But there was no sense of urgency, no blaring alarms. The crew, steeped in the belief of the ship's invincibility, struggled to comprehend the situation. They had never drilled for a full-scale evacuation. Many didn't even know where their assigned lifeboats were. The first orders to the passengers were gentle suggestions. Stewards knocked on doors, telling people to put on their life vests and come up to the boat deck, more as a precaution than an emergency. John Jacob Astor was awakened by the commotion. He went to investigate and returned to his wife, telling her the ship had struck ice but that it did not appear serious. He calmly helped Madeline put on her life vest. The Strausses were also awakened. They dressed and went up to the boat deck, as instructed, observing the quiet, almost surreal scene of crew members beginning to swing out the lifeboats. For many, the danger seemed abstract. The ship's lights were still blazing. The orchestra had begun to play cheerful ragtime tunes in the first-class lounge to keep spirits up, and the deck was only just beginning to list slightly to starboard. Leaving the perceived safety of the massive, well-lit liner for a small open boat to be lowered into the blackness seemed like the more dangerous option. The collision was not a singular, explosive event. It was a quiet, almost gentle beginning to a slow, methodical execution. It was the moment when the Gilded Age's supreme confidence in its own technology collided with the raw, indifferent power of the natural world. The ship, a symbol of human ambition and control, had been fatally wounded. The decisions made in the next 2 hours, by officers and passengers alike, would determine who would live and who would die. The inevitable collision had occurred. The American reckoning was about to begin. Midnight. The boat deck of the Titanic. The air was filled with a strange cacophony, the roar of steam being vented from the funnels, the cheerful, incongruous melodies of the ship's orchestra, and the rising murmur of confused passengers. The ship was visibly sinking now, the forward tilt becoming more pronounced with each passing minute. The illusion of safety was beginning to crumble, replaced by a creeping, chilling dread. The order had been given. Women and children first. It was a principle of maritime chivalry, a code of honor from a bygone era of sailing ships. But on the chaotic deck of the dying liner, it became a brutal, inconsistent, and often cruel filter for survival. The evacuation was a study in contrasts. On the port side, Second Officer Charles Lightoller interpreted the captain's order with extreme rigidity. He allowed only women and children into the lifeboats, turning away men even when there were empty seats. On the starboard side, First Officer Murdoch, the man who had been on the bridge during the collision, used a more practical interpretation, allowing men to board if no more women were present. This single arbitrary difference in judgment would have life or death consequences. As the first lifeboats were prepared for lowering, a new horror became apparent: the sheer reluctance of the passengers to leave the ship. In the early stages, with the liner still seeming vast and stable, many refused to board the small, frail-looking boats. Lifeboat 7, the first to be launched from the starboard side at around 12:45 a.m., left with only 28 people aboard, despite having a capacity for 65. Lifeboat 1, launched a half-hour later, departed with just 12 people, 7 of them male crew members. It was a catastrophic waste of precious space. Amidst this confusion, the American Titans on board faced their final moments, and their actions would become a permanent part of the Titanic legend. John Jacob Astor IV, having ensured his young pregnant wife Madeline was warmly dressed, escorted her to the starboard side. He helped her, along with her maid and nurse, into the descending lifeboat 4. He then asked Second Officer Lightoller if he might join his wife, citing her delicate condition. Lightoller, adhering to his strict interpretation of the rule, refused. "No men are allowed in these boats until the women are loaded first," he stated flatly. Astor, a man accustomed to having his way in all things, did not argue. He simply stepped back. According to survivors, he stood calmly on the deck, lit a cigarette, and watched the boat carrying his wife and unborn child being lowered into the darkness. He was last seen alive on the deck, a solitary, dignified figure against the backdrop of rising chaos. His body would later be recovered from the sea, his wealth and power rendered meaningless by the cold Atlantic. Benjamin Guggenheim's final moments were perhaps the most theatrical, a conscious performance of Gilded Age aristocracy. Realizing the situation was hopeless, he and his valet Victor Gigoulet returned to their cabins. They removed their life vests and sweaters, and changed back into their formal evening wear. They reappeared on deck, Guggenheim reportedly declaring, "We've dressed up in our best, and are prepared to go down as gentlemen." He was seen calmly sipping a brandy and smoking a cigar as the ship went down. He gave a final message to a survivor, a steward, asking him to tell his wife in New York that I did my best in doing my duty. His duty, as he saw it, was to die in the manner his class demanded, a final, futile gesture of control in a situation where he had none. But the most poignant story was that of Isidore and Ida Strauss. The elderly couple, inseparable in life, would choose to remain so in death. Ida was offered a seat in Lifeboat 8. She prepared to get in, but then turned back. Isidore, as a man, was not allowed to board. He urged her to go, to save herself. But she refused. Witnesses heard her say, with unwavering resolve, "We have lived together for many years. Where you go, I go." She stepped out of the boat and gave her place and her warm fur coat to her newly hired English maid, Ellen Bird. The couple was last seen sitting together on a pair of deck chairs, holding hands, calmly waiting for the end. It was a quiet act of love and defiance that would resonate deeply with the American public, a testament to a bond that not even death could break. While the wealthy met their fate with varying degrees of stoicism and performance, the scene in third class was one of sheer terror and desperation. The path from their quarters in the bow and stern to the central boat deck was a confusing labyrinth of corridors and staircases. Many were blocked by locked gates and barriers, designed to comply with U.S. immigration laws to keep steerage passengers segregated until they could be processed at Ellis Island. While there is no evidence of a deliberate policy to keep them below decks, the ship's very design, combined with language barriers and a lack of direction from the crew, created a death trap. Families were separated in the chaos. Men, seeing their wives and children off in the hopes of following later, would never see them again. The sounds from third class were not of quiet resignation, but of frantic prayers, of weeping, of the desperate struggle for survival. By 1:30 a.m., the situation on deck had grown dire. The bow was now deep underwater, and the stern was rising high into the air. The angle of the deck became so steep that it was difficult to stand. The last of the lifeboats were being launched, now filled to capacity as the remaining passengers and crew finally understood the finality of their situation. The ship's orchestra, led by Wallace Hartley, had moved from the lounge to the boat deck. They continued to play, their calm, resilient music, a surreal counterpoint to the unfolding horror. They played until the very end, a final act of service to calm the terrified souls around them. Their music was the ship's last breath of civilization before the final brutal descent. At 2:05 a.m., the last lifeboat, Collapsible D, was launched from the roof of the officers' quarters. The water was now washing over the forward part of the boat deck. The end was moments away. Hundreds of people were still on board, clustered on the rising stern. At approximately 2:18 a.m., the ship's lights, which had burned brightly throughout the sinking, flickered once, then went out, plunging the scene into an awful, terrifying darkness, broken only by the cold light of the stars. The immense stress on the ship's hull, now suspended at a severe angle, became too much. A huge, groaning, tearing sound, described by survivors as the sound of a giant tearing a piece of metal, echoed across the water. The Titanic broke in two, the forward section tearing away and plunging into the depths. The stern section, now filled with over 1,000 desperate souls, righted itself for a moment before it, too, began its final vertical plunge. It rose up against the night sky, a black silhouette, before sliding beneath the waves at 2:20 a.m. The ship was gone, but the horror was not over. In the water, now filled with wreckage, and over 1,500 people, a new sound arose. It was the collective cry of the dying, a sound that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. Officer Lightoller, who survived on an overturned collapsible boat, would later describe it as a continuous moan. The water was 28 degrees Fahrenheit, a temperature at which death from hypothermia comes in minutes. In the 20 lifeboats, now scattered across a 2-mile area, the survivors could only listen, helpless. Most of the boats were too far away, and their crews were terrified of being swamped if they rowed back towards the cries. Only one boat, Lifeboat 14, under the command of 5th Officer Harold Lowe, went back. By the time he had transferred his passengers and returned to the site, it was too late. The great, terrible cry had faded to a few weak calls, and then to silence. He managed to pull only 4 people from the water alive. The American reckoning in the icy Atlantic was complete. The richest man on the ship had died, his fortune unable to buy him a place in a boat. The industrialist had died, his final act a performance of class identity. The devoted merchant had died, choosing love over life. And hundreds of poor immigrants, whose only crime was to be born in the wrong country, and to have bought the cheapest ticket, died in the dark, their American dream drowned in the freezing water. The survivors, adrift in open boats, could only wait, shivering and traumatized, for a dawn they were not sure would come. Their destination had been New York. Their reality was now a floating graveyard, under a canopy of indifferent stars. April 18th, 1912. New York City. For 3 days, the city had been holding its breath. A cold, relentless rain had been falling, turning the streets into a slick gray mirror reflecting the somber mood of its citizens. The initial confusion and false reports of the Titanic's safety had long since given way to the horrifying, confirmed truth. The city was in mourning, but it was a mourning laced with a frantic, desperate need for answers, for names, for some final, terrible certainty. The focus of this city-wide vigil was a single point on the Hudson River. Pier 54, the Cunard Line pier where the rescue ship RMS Carpathia was scheduled to dock. The Carpathia was not just a ship, it was a vessel of ghosts and of miracles, a floating archive of the tragedy. On board were the 705 survivors of the Titanic, and on board too was the first complete story of what had happened in the mid-Atlantic, a story the entire world was waiting to hear. All day the crowds had been gathering. By evening a vast multitude, estimated at over 40,000 people, pressed against the police barricades that cordoned off the pier and the surrounding streets of the meatpacking district. They were a cross-section of the great metropolis itself. Anxious relatives of the first-class passengers, huddled under umbrellas, their fine clothes soaked through, working-class families, friends and neighbors of the second- and third-class passengers, their faces etched with a weary grief. And thousands of the curious, drawn by the sheer magnetic horror of the event. They stood in the driving rain, their faces upturned towards the dark, empty expanse of the river, waiting. The press was there in force, a horde of reporters and photographers, their flash powder pans ready to illuminate the scene with harsh, brilliant bursts of light. The telegraph offices were working at a fever pitch, their lines humming with speculation, and the few precious names of the confirmed survivors that had been trickled out from the Carpathia as it steamed towards the city. The ship had maintained a strict wireless silence on the details of the disaster, on the orders of its captain Arthur Rostron, who wanted to protect the traumatized survivors from the press and to deliver his official report first. This silence had only fueled the public's desperate hunger for information. Around 8:30 p.m., a ship's lights were spotted moving slowly up the harbor. A wave of anticipation, a collective gasp, moved through the crowd. It was the Carpathia, but it did not head directly for PR 54. In a somber, haunting detour, the ship first sailed north to PR 59, the White Star Line PR, where the Titanic herself was supposed to have docked. There, under the glare of spotlights, the crew of the Carpathia lowered the Titanic's 13 lifeboats, which they had picked up from the sea. The sight of these small, empty, battered boats, some still containing the grim debris of the sinking, was the first tangible evidence of the disaster for the waiting city. They were like coffins, a silent, damning testament to all the souls that had been lost. Then the Carpathia turned and made its final slow approach to PR 54. As it neared the dock, a profound, eerie silence fell over the massive crowd. The only sounds were the lapping of the water against the pilings and the steady, miserable drumming of the rain. The ship was a dark shape, its decks lined with the ghostly figures of the survivors, wrapped in blankets. As the gangplank was lowered, the scene exploded into a frenzy of contained chaos. The flash pans of the photographers erupted, casting the rain-swept pier in a series of stark, momentary tableaus. Doctors, nurses, and aid workers from the Women's Relief Committee and the Travelers' Aid Society rushed aboard. The first survivors began to emerge. They were a procession of shock and grief, women in borrowed, ill-fitting clothes, their faces pale and streaked with tears, some clutching small children who looked dazed and bewildered. A few men, their expressions hollow, their eyes staring into a distance only they could see. They stumbled down the gangplank into the arms of waiting relatives, leading to wrenching scenes of reunion and the dawning awful realization for those whose loved ones did not appear. Madeline Astor, the young pregnant widow of John Jacob Astor, was one of the first to disembark, shielded from the press by her family. Her face was a mask of grief. The story of her husband's quiet heroism had already begun to circulate, and she was now the most famous widow in America. Bruce Ismay, the chairman of the White Star Line, the highest-ranking official to survive, was spirited away through a private exit. He was heavily sedated, his reputation already in tatters. He was seen by one reporter as a man broken with grief and sorrow, but for much of the public, he was already becoming the villain of the story, the man who had taken a place in a lifeboat while women and children drowned. The survivors of the lower decks emerged last, the anonymous faces of the tragedy. They had lost everything, their possessions, their savings, and in many cases their entire families. They had no wealthy relatives waiting for them, no suites at the Plaza Hotel. They were met by aid workers who guided them to shelters, their American dream having turned into a nightmare before they had even set foot on its shores. One by one the stories began to spill out, tales of horror and heroism that the reporters scribbled down in their notepads. The story of the ship breaking in two, the story of the band playing until the end, the story of Officer Lowe going back to rescue survivors from the water, and the terrible haunting sound of 1,500 people crying for help in the darkness. The arrival of the Carpathia was the moment the Titanic disaster became visceral, a human event written on the faces of the survivors. It was no longer a distant news report, a series of dots and dashes from a telegraph machine. It was here, in the heart of New York, the city that was to have been the ship's triumphant destination, the city of broken dreams. The grief of the city was immense. Memorial concerts were held. Funds were established for the victims, raising vast sums from both the rich and the poor. The tragedy cut across all class lines, a shared wound for a city that was a mosaic of all the people who had been on that ship. But beneath the grief, another emotion was stirring, an emotion that was quintessentially American, a demand for accountability. The stories of the locked gates in steerage, the ignored ice warnings, the shocking lack of lifeboats, the survival of the company chairman, these details sparked a wave of public outrage. This was not an act of God. This was a failure of man, a failure of a system that had prioritized profit and luxury over human life. The public and the politicians who answered to them wanted to know who was responsible. They wanted justice, and they would not be content to wait for a polite British inquiry to deliver it. The survivors had landed on American soil. They were now subject to American law. And in Washington, Senator William Alden Smith was waiting, his subpoenas already drawn up. The period of mourning was ending. The investigation was about to begin. April 19, 1912. The Waldorf Astoria Hotel, New York City. Less than 24 hours after the Carpathia had docked, in the opulent east room of the city's most luxurious hotel, an unprecedented event in legal and maritime history began. The United States Senate Subcommittee on Commerce, led by the indomitable Senator William Alden Smith, convened its official inquiry into the sinking of the RMS Titanic. The choice of venue was a masterstroke of political theater. Instead of a sterile committee room in Washington, Smith brought the inquiry to the heart of the city most affected by the tragedy, into a setting of Gilded Age splendor that mirrored the very luxury of the lost ship. The message was clear: the power of the American government would meet the power of the corporate world on its own turf. Smith's actions were audacious, a stunning assertion of American authority. He had moved with astonishing speed. Even before the Carpathia had arrived, he had ensured his resolution passed the Senate, granting him full powers to subpoena witnesses. The moment the survivors set foot on American soil, they were served with legal documents compelling their testimony. The British officers and crew, including the surviving senior officer Charles Lightoller and the managing director of the White Star Line J. Bruce Ismay, were forbidden from leaving the country. They were, in effect, prisoners of the United States Senate. This move sent shockwaves through London and the global shipping community. It was seen as a radical overreach, a populist American stunt. Who were these upstart Americans to investigate the loss of a British-registered ship, operated by a British crew, in international waters? The British press was furious, decrying Yankee sensationalism and defending the honor of their seamen. But Senator Smith was unmoved by the criticism. He was not a maritime expert, a fact his critics relentlessly pointed out. He was a lawyer from Michigan, who knew more about railroads than shipping lanes. But he possessed something more important: a profound sense of moral outrage and a brilliant instinct for cross-examination. He was not interested in the polite deferrals of the British class system. He was interested in the truth, and he would get it by any means necessary. The first witness to be called was the most controversial, the most reviled man in the immediate aftermath of the disaster: Joseph Bruce Ismay. As Ismay took the stand, a hush fell over the crowded room. He was a man in disgrace, the architect of the ship's philosophy of size and luxury, who had stepped into a lifeboat while over 1,500 people, including many of his own customers and employees, went to their deaths. Smith's questioning was relentless and surgical. He began by establishing the ownership structure of the ship, forcing Ismay to admit, under oath, that the White Star Line was controlled by J.P. Morgan's American-based EMM. He immediately framed the disaster not as a British affair, but as the failure of an American-owned trust. Then, he bored in on the key questions. Why was the ship traveling so fast? Ismay equivocated, suggesting it was standard practice. Smith pressed him, asking if he had encouraged Captain Smith to maintain speed, to make a good showing on the maiden voyage. Ismay denied it, but the implication hung in the air. Then came the lifeboats. Smith forced Ismay to state the exact number of boats on board: 20, and the number of people they could carry: 1,178, and then the devastating follow-up: how many people were actually on the ship. The stark, brutal mathematics of the failure were laid bare for the public record. Ismay, under the strain, seemed to shrink on the witness stand. His answers were often evasive, his memory suddenly poor. When questioned about his own survival, he claimed he had only stepped into the last lifeboat from the starboard side, after ensuring no other women were in the vicinity. But his testimony was unconvincing. He became the living symbol of corporate cowardice, a reputation that would follow him to his grave. Over the next 18 days, the inquiry was a relentless procession of witnesses, a living narrative of the disaster told by those who had endured it. Smith and his committee worked tirelessly, holding sessions in New York and later in the new caucus room of the Senate Office Building in Washington. Smith's questioning style was often unorthodox. He would ask questions that revealed his lack of nautical knowledge, such as why passengers couldn't have been saved by being placed inside the watertight compartments. The British press ridiculed him for these gaffes, but his plain-spoken, sometimes blunt approach was remarkably effective. He was speaking not as a maritime expert, but as a representative of the common man, asking the questions that ordinary people wanted answered. He put Second Officer Charles Lightoller on the stand. The officer, a model of British stoicism, gave a detailed professional account of the sinking. But Smith pressed him on the ignored ice warnings, on the missing binoculars for the lookouts, on his rigid women and children only policy that had led to lifeboats leaving half empty. He questioned Harold Bride, the surviving wireless operator, about the dismissed warnings from the Californian, forcing the young man to recount the fatal "shut up, I am busy" message sent by his senior colleague. One by one, the layers of negligence and hubris were peeled back. The inquiry revealed a systemic failure. There was no single villain, but rather a chain of flawed assumptions and poor decisions. The belief that the ship was unsinkable had bred a fatal complacency. There had been no lifeboat drills. The crew was unfamiliar with the launching procedures. The warnings of a massive ice field directly in their path had been treated with a shocking lack of urgency. Perhaps the most damning testimony came in relation to the nearby SS Californian. The American inquiry established through the testimony of its crew that the ship had been stopped in the ice less than 20 miles from the Titanic and had seen its distress rockets. But the Californian's captain, Stanley Lord, had not roused his wireless operator to investigate, assuming they were merely company signals. The rockets, 8 of them, fired over the course of an hour, were dismissed. The ship that could have saved hundreds of lives lay silent, its masthead light a tantalizing, unreachable star on the horizon for those dying in the water. The American inquiry was swift, public, and brutal. It stood in stark contrast to the British inquiry that followed, which was widely seen as a more staid affair, designed as much to protect the reputation of the British shipping industry as to find the truth. The British inquiry, led by Lord Mersey, would ultimately clear both the White Star Line and the British Board of Trade of negligence, concluding that the Titanic had followed the standard, albeit flawed, practices of the time. But the American inquiry had already seized the global narrative. Senator Smith's final report, submitted to Congress on May 28, 1912, was a scathing indictment. It did not mince words. It condemned the excessive speed of the ship, the failure to heed ice warnings, the inadequate number of lifeboats, and the lack of response from the SS Californian. The report concluded that the disaster was an act of God only insofar as it was an act of nature, but that the horrific loss of life was due to preventable human error and negligence. The senator's crusade had a profound and lasting impact. It was a declaration that American law and American standards of accountability would apply even to the proud maritime traditions of Great Britain. The public outrage fueled by the inquiry led directly to sweeping revolutionary changes in maritime safety. The Radio Act of 1912 was passed, mandating that all ships carry wireless equipment and maintain a 24-hour radio watch. The inquiry's findings were instrumental in the first International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea (SOLAS), held in London in 1914, which established international standards for lifeboat requirements and safety procedures. And as a direct result of the disaster, the U.S. Navy began patrolling the ice fields of the North Atlantic, a practice that evolved into the International Ice Patrol, operated by the U.S. Coast Guard to this day. William Alden Smith, the railroad lawyer from Michigan, had done more than just investigate a shipwreck. He had held the most powerful corporation in the world accountable. He had challenged the supremacy of the British maritime establishment, and he had forced the entire world to confront the deadly consequences of its own arrogance, ensuring that the 1,500 souls lost with the Titanic did not die in vain. The hidden American story of the Titanic was not just about its owners or its passengers. It was about its aftermath, about a nation that refused to accept the official story, and through a stubborn senator's crusade, rewrote the laws of the sea for generations to come. The wake of the Titanic disaster spread far beyond the legislative chambers of Washington and the boardrooms of London. The sinking of the great ship was more than a maritime tragedy. It was a profound cultural and psychological blow, a moment that marked the symbolic end of an era. The Gilded Age, with its unshakable faith in progress, its worship of technology, and its celebration of unrestrained wealth, had believed itself to be unsinkable. The Titanic was the ultimate expression of that belief, a monument of steel and luxury that proclaimed humanity's mastery over nature. Its demise, in a single horrifying night, shattered that illusion with the force of a physical impact. The loss was felt deeply in the American psyche. The names of Astor, Guggenheim, and Strauss were not just names of rich men, they were pillars of the American establishment. Their deaths, alongside hundreds of anonymous immigrants in steerage, served as a grim democratic leveler. The icy water of the Atlantic had made no distinction between the millionaire in his suite and the peasant in his bunk. This stark reality challenged the era's comforting myths about a divinely ordered society, where wealth and power offered a kind of insulation from the harsher realities of life. For a brief, shocking moment, the rigid class structure of the age was exposed as a fragile artifice, as vulnerable as the steel plates of a sunken ship. The stories that emerged from the disaster became modern parables, shaping American culture for a century to come. The quiet heroism of John Jacob Astor, the steadfast love of Isidore and Ida Strauss, the stoic professionalism of the ship's band playing until the end. These tales were retold in newspapers, in songs, in poems, and later in films. They provided a narrative of grace and courage in the face of unimaginable horror, a way to find meaning in a seemingly meaningless event. Conversely, the story of Bruce Ismay became a cautionary tale about corporate responsibility and the moral failings of the powerful. His survival, while so many others perished, made him a pariah. He became a symbol of the perceived selfishness of the elite, and the public condemnation he faced was a reflection of a growing populist anger against the unchecked power of the trusts and monopolies that Morgan and his contemporaries had built. The disaster also became a catalyst for a new era of government regulation. Senator Smith's inquiry was a landmark moment, demonstrating the federal government's willingness to aggressively investigate and regulate private industry in the name of public safety. The idea that corporations had a responsibility not just to their shareholders, but to the public, was powerfully reinforced. The sinking of the Titanic helped fuel the progressive movement's call for greater oversight of big business, a movement that would reshape American politics in the decades to come. The tangible legacies are still with us. Every time a ship maintains a 24-hour radio watch, it is an echo of the Titanic. Every time a vessel follows the shipping lanes charted by the International Ice Patrol, it is an echo of the Titanic. Every time a cruise ship conducts a mandatory lifeboat drill, it is an echo of the Titanic. The 1,500 souls lost in 1912 became the unwilling sacrifice for the safety of millions of future sea travelers. In the years that followed, the world moved on. The Titanic's sister ship, the Britannic, never served a commercial passenger. It was requisitioned as a hospital ship during World War I and was sunk by a German mine in the Aegean Sea in 1916. The Great War itself would soon eclipse the Titanic disaster, unleashing a scale of death and destruction that made the loss of a single ship seem almost quaint. The Gilded Age gave way to a modern world of global conflict, economic depression, and technological warfare. The confident, optimistic world that had built the Titanic was gone forever. For 73 years, the ship itself rested in silent, mythic darkness, 2.5 miles beneath the surface of the Atlantic. Its location was a mystery, its hull a legendary, undiscovered tomb. Its story was kept alive by a dwindling number of survivors, by historians, and by the enduring power of the myth. Then, in 1985, a joint American-French expedition led by Dr. Robert Ballard finally found the wreck. The first images that came back from the deep were haunting. The great ship was not preserved as many had imagined. It was broken, decaying, covered in rusticles that consumed its steel hull, but it was unmistakably there. The grand staircase was a void, the glass dome was gone. But the bow still jutted proudly from the seabed, an ghostly, unforgettable image. The discovery of the wreck reignited the world's fascination with the story. It was no longer just a story, it was an archaeological site, a memorial. The artifacts brought back from the debris field, a pair of spectacles, a child's toy, a stack of dinner plates, a waterlogged piece of sheet music, were not just objects. They were tangible connections to the lives that were lost, intimate relics that made the human cost of the tragedy more real than ever before. The story of the Titanic endures because it is more than a story about a shipwreck. It is a story about human arrogance and its consequences. It is a story about the collision of technology and nature. It is a story about class, courage, and cowardice. And at its heart, it is a profoundly American story. It was born of the ambition of an American financier, J.P. Morgan, who sought to conquer the Atlantic. It was populated by the titans of American industry, the very men who defined the Gilded Age. Its destination was the ultimate symbol of the American dream, New York City. Its most hopeful passengers were the thousands of immigrants steaming toward a new life in America, and its most lasting legacy was written by an American senator whose relentless pursuit of accountability forever changed the world. The ship never reached its American destination, but in its failure, in its tragedy, and in the echoes it left in law, in culture, and in the silent, dark deep, the Titanic found its permanent home in the American story.